Welcome to our third module on integrating ESA into the National Flood Insurance Program here in the Puget Sound. In this module, we're going to talk more about the biological opinion issued by the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service on implementing the NFIP in the Puget Sound. So if you listened to the last module, I mentioned the Endangered Species Act and Section 7 of that act. In that Section 7, the Endangered Species Act puts forth the requirement for federal agencies to comply with the act. And part of that is that federal agencies are required to consult with the services on on Endangered Species Act compliance. And when I refer to the services, I'm talking about the two federal agencies that administer the Endangered Species Act. This is the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And through that consultation between these federal agencies, we are trying to ensure that the actions of the action agency, in this case, it would be FEMA implementing the National Flood Insurance Program, are not likely to either jeopardize the continued existence of listed species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat of those species. And back in 2004, the National Wildlife Federation made it clear that FEMA had not done that consultation properly and was potentially violating Section 7A2 of the Endangered Species Act. The result of that court ruling was that, in fact, yes, FEMA had not properly consulted with either of the services on our implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program. And so we then began that formal consultation process. And we began that with the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service because of these species brought to attention in the litigation. They were specifically marine and anadromous species, primarily salmonids, that are under the jurisdiction of the National Marine Fisheries Service. So it was a multi-year process to go through that consultation. And in 2008, the National Marine Fisheries Service issued a biological opinion, which included a jeopardy determination that says, yes, implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program causes jeopardy to these listed species. Inclusive in that jeopardy determination is what's called a reasonable and prudent alternative. And it's essentially that. It's an alternative recommended by National Marine Fisheries Service of ways to implement the National Flood Insurance Program going forward that would not cause continued jeopardy for the listed species. So we took a few years to work with NOAA Fisheries to figure out what that implementation approach should look like. And starting in 2014, FEMA began implementing adjusted performance standards to meet these ESA requirements for participating communities in the Puget Sound. And to give you some idea of what that reasonable and prudent alternative consisted of, there were multiple elements that were addressed in the recommendations, the alternatives, and those included recommendations for notifying our communities of the jeopardy determination, recommendations for changes to some of our mapping procedures, recommendations for changing how communities consider impacts to fish habitat when issuing floodplain development permits, avoidance of adverse modifications to habitat and compensation for adversely affected habitat. There have been some changes as a result of this to our community rating system program, recommendations also for levees, vegetation maintenance, and how we report on development permitting in the region to the services. And again, these were recommendations set forth in the reasonable and prudent alternative. Some component of these have been moved forward in FEMA's implementation of these. So specifically, the species that were identified in the Puget Sound biological opinion are 17 listed species and their subspecies, the primary of which are the Puget Sound Chinook, Puget Sound steelhead, the Hood Canal summer run chum, Lake Ozette sockeye, and the southern resident killer whale. And so all of these salmonid species that were included in the agreement are threatened, and then the southern resident killer whale is listed as endangered. And so because of that, because southern residents are endangered, they were included primarily because their main food source is the Puget Sound Chinook. And so by causing jeopardy to the Puget Sound Chinook, we indirectly cause jeopardy to the southern residents. And so the action area that we're talking about here for Puget Sound implementation consists of 122 different participating communities within the Puget Sound watershed. And so the watershed includes the 12 counties that you see here, but it excludes the drainages out to the west coast, the coastal drainages. We just have the entire counties included in here because each of the counties are participating communities themselves. And I want to recognize that Puget Sound's not alone in this kind of litigation that's been brought against implementation of our floodplain management programs. Back in 1994 was our first court ruling against the NFIP and the key deer habitat in Monroe County, Florida. And since then, there have been multiple other decisions made against or regarding the silvery minnow habitat and the southwest flycatcher in New Mexico and Arizona, respectively. And then on the west coast, if you look at this map here, you can tell that salmonids have been the primary reason for some of these court cases brought against FEMA in impacting important salmonid critical habitat along our west coast. So Oregon is currently planning for similar implementations after a jeopardy opinion in that state. And then California as well is working on a settlement agreement on similar litigation. So I highlight this knowing that the Puget Sound biological opinion really has been instrumental in determining long-term solutions for national implementation of our important program. And so what we're doing here has been influential in figuring out maybe how we can come about solutions for a national shift in the program. And of course, we all recognize that these changes don't come without their own challenges. Incorporating fish considerations into floodplain management is no easy feat, nor is it a common thing to do. FEMA also doesn't have any land use authority to help local communities make these changes. Yet we manage the program, and so we have to work with those who are implementing the program on the ground to make sure the implementation is feasible for our local communities. Regulations might differ from community to community, state to state, tribe to tribe, and there are often competing regulations as well. And so we need to work in ways that recognize those and account for those as best we can. There are often also outdated habitats and habits and expectations that might kind of influence what we think it means to do good floodplain management. So it really does seem like we are in the midst of an important paradigm shift. We've had several decades of developing ingrained habits about what it means to do floodplain management well. The requirement to address natural and beneficial floodplain function has always existed, although it's not always been at the forefront of our land use planning and floodplain management decisions. And you know, good work is being done all over the Puget Sound region and all over the country. And so hopefully that recognizing the benefits of floodplain functions can help to bring this good work to the surface and help us kind of bring light to the fact that floodplains are part of a much bigger ecosystem, and that maintaining beneficial functions and maintaining natural functions of floodplains can help us reduce flood risk in our communities as well. And so part of this thinking is understanding that although salmonids are aquatic species, they do require floodplains as part of their critical habitat because they rely on floodplains for survival during flash floods and high water flows. So the intention behind the biological opinion really is to protect essential physical and biological features that are necessary for these species to not only survive, but to hopefully recover from their listings. And so protecting these features, like what we have here on the screen, also helps us use floodplains more safely. So ensuring that we have good water quality, maintaining that important riparian vegetation on our stream banks, that in part allows for forage opportunity for invertebrates and fish, and just generally maintaining habitat forming processes that allow habitat not only to develop but to exist in perpetuity can help us further along that important floodplain function. And so the BIOP talks about floodplain function in the physical as well as biological resources. So let's dig into those a little bit. So from a hydrology and hydraulics perspective, maintaining flood storage and conveyance is critical for maintaining, for knowing how water is going to move through a system. Also, allowing for that storage and conveyance can help promote infiltration for aquifer recharge, so maintaining that groundwater as well. And ultimately, all of this can help to reduce the frequency and duration of low surface flows. So we have fewer floods throughout each year. Looking at ecological resources, it's important to understand that by maintaining healthy floodplains, we also promote biodiversity and productivity within these ecosystems. That riparian vegetation and in-stream vegetation filters runoff, it pulls sediment out of the water column and buffers against harmful pollutants. These areas are critical nursery habitats for fish and for a wide variety of young species. They also offer refuge during flood events, and when adult salmon come back upriver, we have spawning resources for those adult salmon as well. So I'm talking a lot about, how good floodplains develop or how good floodplains benefit salmon, but also we're here to talk about the flood insurance program generally, right? So we need to think about this definition of development that really is at the core of a lot of the decisions we make around floodplain management. So if we look at the standard definition of development as it's written in the Code of Federal Regulations, it tells us that any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, or drilling operations, or storage of equipment and materials, falls under that definition. In the Puget Sound area, where we are implementing the biological opinion, we also have another phrase added to that definition of development, which is also inclusive of the removal of more than 5% of native vegetation on the property or alteration of natural site characteristics. And so that last part, alteration of natural site characteristics, really gets at this importance of maintaining natural function to maintain those habitat characteristics that are essential for our species survival. And so let's dig into some of the common development activities that might impact our floodplain characteristics. So when we have fill in our floodplain, we often have diminished ecosystem processes for creating and maintaining habitat. The fill can eliminate riparian and wetland resources. It can constrain flow, changing channel dynamics, and potentially increasing velocity, which then leads to increased erosion and scour. And aquatic areas that are converted to upland eliminate these important flood refuge areas that provide important spawning as well as rearing habitat. When we think about vegetation removal and those impacts on our floodplain functions, we often lose shade and temperature control, which can lead to reduced dissolved oxygen levels. And vegetation removal limits the shelter provided from predation by these prey species, and a loss of habitat for the prey species. So not only can they not hide from their predators, they have less habitat to survive in the first place. Decreased bank stability due to erosion, as you can see in the picture here. as well as inability to trap sediment. So you'll have increasingly turbid water that in turn affects dissolved oxygen levels. Additionally, if we look at water quality impacts, floodplain development can impact hyporheic function, which is really the exchange of water from the river channel into our groundwater, into the soil surrounding the stream bed. It can be impacted by vegetation removal and additions of impervious surface. Also, pollutants in stormwater runoff may not be mitigated as well, and so we'll have increased pollutants running through our water systems. Also, loss of floodwater and groundwater recharge as a result of impervious surface or impaction and similar impacts. So, thinking of all of these development impacts, they're not just particular to, say, a riverine habitat. They can influence any type of flood hazard area that the National Flood Insurance Program considers. And that includes marine shorelines, because these are regulatory floodplains as well. And when we're looking at marine shorelines, we're really thinking about the nearshore marine habitat. And the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service defines the nearshore marine habitat as everything from high astronomical tide, which you see indicated on this image here with the red arrow, all the way out to a depth of about 30 meters. And so if you think of that tidal area and that shallow water area, there's a diverse ecosystem that exists within that range. And so when we're thinking about floodplain development, we're thinking about development on these marine shorelines, we need to also think about how development in different elevations of the marine shoreline area can impact different species. In terms of the special flood hazard area, the FEMA coastal zones typically extend to extreme high tide, which you see as the furthest inland arrow at the top of your graphic. And then the state and other federal agencies such as Army Corps tend to have other jurisdictional lines in the sand, essentially. The state measures to ordinary high water, and the Army Corps typically measures to mean higher high water. Now, there are conversations happening about that Army Corps jurisdiction, and so I encourage you to look specifically at your project area and work with your local community to understand which line in the sand you are looking at when you are looking at a proposed development project. Additionally, if you have a project that, say, gets concurrence for ESA compliance under an Army Corps permit, it's important to make sure that that project is either fully included within that concurrence, so the project area is completely covered. And if not, you must ensure that your ESA compliance requirements are met for the rest of that project area, if not included in the Army Corps analysis. Further looking at that marine shoreline area, when we think about kind of the tidal zone, and we're walking along the beach, say, we have a lot of stuff that washes up on shore. That's called beach wrack, and it's part of an important detrital food web. So dead eelgrass, logs that wash up on shore, all that stuff that's on the beach is really critical habitat for a variety of invertebrates and insects and sometimes smaller fish. And that is critical food sources for our forage fish, which in turn are prey for our important salmonids and the like. And we have a lot of really important tidal habitat here in the Puget Sound. We also have a lot of development in our tidal areas and on our shorelines. Specifically, we have a lot of bulkheads that are placed to protect residential properties throughout the Puget Sound. Around 25% or more of the shoreline in the Puget Sound is armored in some fashion. And so that's habitat that is now disconnected from the upland to the marine habitat. And that disconnection allows for, or it does not allow for a lot of these ecosystem processes to function properly. And so that's a consideration that we have to take in mind when we are doing armoring. Is it necessary to protect a structure behind that armoring, or can we do without it? And again, just looking at this important food web that our development can impact, starting with our beach wrack that is important for our phytoplankton and zooplankton that in turn feeds our forage fish and our salmonids, and then of course our southern residents who rely on our salmonids for their primary food source. At the end of the day, what we are doing in our marine shorelines can affect some really critical species in our part of the world. So what does all of this have to do with development? Well, getting back to that shift in the definition of development for Puget Sound communities, we want to think about alterations to natural site characteristics, right? So what decisions do we make in our development proposals, in our development decisions that can change those characteristics, and how do those changes in turn affect the safety of our development? As you see here, one of these houses was built further back from the shore than the other, um, potentially because they were considering natural site characteristics. And so when we are considering our surroundings and development, we might consider a graphic like this that is similar to the image that we were just looking at. Not only setting the building back might not only protect the structure itself from erosion caused by saturated soils closer to the shoreline, it may also prevent some additional erosion by maintaining those habitat functions, like maintaining trees closer to the shoreline that prevent erosion, avoiding armoring to allow for those habitat forming processes to continue. And so we want to consider the risk associated with development, not only in our riverine systems, but in our coastal systems, as well as how maintaining those functions might actually add to the safety component in our development. And so I want to leave you with a example of kind of a restoration project that got at some of these natural and beneficial functions in its restoration goals in Bellingham. This is the Marine Park in Bellingham that, if you look at the left side of the screen, used to be largely rip-wrapped and didn't really have beach access. You could get down to the water by walking over the riprap, and maybe when the tide was out, you could walk along the sand a bit, but as you can see on the right side of the screen, by removing that shoreline armoring and allowing these natural habitat forming processes to come back, we see that beach wrack on the shore. We see that the tide can go up as far as it needs to and go down unimpeded during high tide and low tide. But you can also see that some of that armoring was maintained. And that's because behind where this photographer was standing, there's a railway system. And so by understanding that we can allow nature to prevail in some places, but and oftentimes we do need to have that armoring. And so understanding that there can be a balance in our communities of protecting natural function, but also protecting structures where necessary, we can have a more dynamic system and a more more well-rounded appreciation of the floodplain functions in our communities. So thank you. And in our next module, we'll get into more of the specifics of implementing the biological opinion in our communities.